Greetings, fellow Who Gazers, and welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the podcast taking you through the world of the Target novelizations in publication order. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. We have a lot to talk about this week. We are beginning the 1978 Target books with Doctor Who and the Face of Evil, and I will have a guest joining me very shortly. However, there's been a lot of other stuff going on in the world. I am recording this on the Saturday after the Monday on which the final episode of Better Call Saul aired, and instant reaction seems pretty unanimous that this is one of the great series finales of all time among American series. For my money, it was deeply thought-provoking, whereas Breaking Bad was the original series to which Better Call Saul is both the prequel and sequel. The Breaking Bad finale was pretty pat, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. The Better Call Saul finale left us with a lot more to think about and a more ambiguous ending. It certainly puts Saul / Jimmy / Gene in a position where he is atoning for all the bad stuff he did, but also at the same time gives him something of a happy ending. I have embarked upon a rewatch of the series. It'll be fairly slow and sporadic, but I'm very, very satisfied with the finale, and I'm going to miss that series tremendously. You will note during my interview with Lelon coming up, we do talk about Better Call Saul, but that interview was recorded 2 or 3 weeks ago, long before the finale. I will be out of town the last 2 weeks of August, so I have been pre-recording many of the next 3 episodes, including this one, which is why the Better Call Saul chat later on in this episode is going to be somewhat retrospective. This is also the week that saw the release of the trailer for the new Doctor Who Blu-ray Collection box set, Season 2, the first black and white box set, the first William Hartnell era box set. I am more excited for this than I have been for anything Doctor Who related in a very long time. Pete McTighe, as usual, did the trailer. It brings back Maureen O'Brien in character as Vicky, and boy, Maureen O'Brien does a phenomenal job. Just gets the emotion and the heart of the character right there in the trailer. And of course, many of the extras and special features that are being promised on the Blu-ray box set also look incredible. Cannot wait for that to come out. As most of you probably know, the Hartnell era is pretty much my favorite era of the show. Anybody who wants me on their podcast to discuss the Hartnell era, you know where to find me. Also this week, I received the newest Black Archive from Obverse Books. This is number 60, The Sunmakers, by a friend of the podcast, Louis Baston, who joined me earlier to discuss Doctor Who and the Dinosaur Invasion. Louis was a terrific guest, and this book, The Black Archive on The Sunmakers, is a terrific book. You can find my earlier appearance with Louis back in episode 20, and he will be back in the coming weeks and months to discuss another Doctor Who novelization with me. I am about halfway through the book so far. Louis is the third Black Archives writer that I've had on this show, and there's just a new revelation, something I hadn't thought about on every page. I've always enjoyed Sunmakers on a surface level. It is in my second tier of favorite stories as far as the classic series and the Tom Baker era goes. But Lewis's Black Archives goes into so much more detail than that and gives me a lot of information that I missed. Very happy to read it, and I will talk about that book with him some more the next time that he's here. As you all know, my email address is drwholiterature. That's drwholiterature@gmail.com. And speaking of the Black Archives books, here's our letter of the week. Just a quick note, says the email, to let you know how much I'm enjoying your podcast. It's long overdue. We had something like this, and I'm really enjoying what you're doing with it. I was also pleasantly surprised to get a shout-out on your Talons episode with Kate and John. Thanks for letting people hear about the Black Archives. Hopefully it'll push a few people our way. Cheers, Dale Smith. Now, typically, when I am a fan of something, I send fan emails. I'm not used to getting fan emails from someone that I am a fan of, but getting an email from Dale Smith really made my week. Dale wrote one of the BBC books' past Doctor adventures in the mid-2000s, Heritage. I was really, really taken with that book, and I had posted a review of that on the Doctor Who ratings guide at the time that I read it. I encourage you to check out my review. It was written over 15 years ago. Uh, as sometimes happens with me, whatever I am watching or experiencing in the world often finds its way into unrelated reviews. So I tied in my review of Heritage to a particular US TV series and episode that I had been also enamored of that week. I possibly would write that review a little differently now, but it was a very good book. And Dale also wrote the Black Archive for Talons of Weng-Chiang, which came out just a few months ago. That is Black Archive Books number 58. So Black Archives is a terrific series. Obverse Books is just incredibly good at putting out Doctor Who content. And Dale, thanks so much for the email. It was terrific to hear from you. I will point out that I am not the first Targets podcast out there. My friend Tony Witt here in the States has been running the Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast for several years now. He's been a guest on this show, and I've been a guest on his. He and his panel go through the books in story order. I have been going through the books in publication order, but I view my podcast very much as a companion piece to what Tony is doing, and I've certainly enjoyed appearing on his show, and I'm hoping to have him and his panelists back on here in the future. Turning to this week's book, it's Doctor Who and the Face of Evil by Terrance Dicks, the first of the 1978 novelizations. Reading back through these books, I'm always interested to see what marks I may have made when I was a tween that I don't remember making. You recall how surprised I was when I opened my copy of Doctor Who and the Deadly Assassin and saw that I had drawn an illustration of a TARDIS on the title page. What I notice about Face of Evil is that I put the cliffhanger marks in a different place than usual. Typically, I would write the episode number at the start of the chapter or at the start of the scene where the next episode began, but for Face of Evil, I drew a line in red ink at the bottom of the cliffhanger moment. I recall that this was the very first way that I chose to mark off the cliffhangers in my books. Now, in my 11-year-old hand, these are far from straight lines. They would certainly be a lot neater if I were to do them today. I know that I did this as well for the Caves of Androzani novelization. I had forgotten that I did it for Face of Evil as well, but what it tells me is that this is probably one of the first novelizations in which I marked off the cliffhanger. Naturally, for a lot of the Hartnell and Troughton books, I wouldn't have known where the cliffhangers were, so I only did that for stories that I'd seen on television at that point. The red line is not very aesthetically pleasing, and I can see why I dropped it soon afterwards. But right now, let's welcome my guest for the week to talk about Doctor Who and the Face of Evil, and let's get to it. Here to discuss Doctor Who and the Face of Evil with me is Doctor Who podcaster from the state of California, Lelon Stoldt. Lelon, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So, Leland, you and I met on Twitter. You were commenting on my pilgrimage, and we started following each other's posts. And then I met you at Gallifrey 1 back in February. I assume that was not your first Gallifrey convention?
No, I've been going to Gallifrey for a couple years now, several years at this point. I think maybe 6 years. Obviously, we all missed one in between, right?
Of course.
And it's become a tradition. I'm there every year. I'm in Southern California, so it's too convenient not to go.
I have been there on and off since 2008. I was living in Los Angeles at the time, so that was the first galley that I went to. I missed the Airtel days, but I was at the LAX Marriott in 2008. Then I didn't go again until 2015, and I've been going almost every year since then. Obviously, of course, we all missed 2021, but I met you this time at the Podcasters Meetup. I think it was on the Saturday this year, 2022, and we had a long talk with Adam Clegg, who was on this show a couple of weeks ago, and you and I sat down over my list of upcoming episodes, and this was the story that you picked. So before we come to this story, let's talk a little bit about your podcast. You have a really nifty idea for a show. What is your show?
Oh, I force my young children to read Doctor Who novels and then make them talk about it for like 10 minutes. Very very short episodes. Um, kind of born from the pandemic actually when we were doing homeschooling like a lot of other people, and we were a little concerned about, we don't like to say they're behind, but we were a little concerned about the youngest one's reading level, and I needed to do more reading with her at night. And I don't like reading children's books, so I started reading Doctor Who in sort of the episode order, and we would read the book and then watch the episode, and then we talk about it. We record for like an hour, but we get 12 minutes of usable footage when you're recording with kids.
Of course, they're easily distracted and move on to other topics, of course. How old are your kids?
They're 8 and 10 now.
So you started with Unearthly Child and you're going in story order, or are you going in publication order like I'm doing?
No, we're going in airing order. So we're gonna do all the first Doctor episodes and then see how we feel after that.
What are you up to now?
So the actually season two, I'm going to sort of schedule to release right when this comes out. So that's Planet of Giants, and we've got a few more in the bag. But we just did the best one so far, which is the Romans.
So, obviously, we have not done most of the Hardinals on my show yet because I'm going in publication order, and the bulk of the Hardinals don't come out until the mid 80s. We're kicking off 1978 with this week's episode. So, it's going to be a while before we get to a lot of those season one books that didn't come out until 20 years after they aired. But when you're going in story order and you're talking about young children, there are two pitfalls that I can see, and I'm very curious to know how you get around this. Number one, you're watching what is now nearly 60-year-old black and white television, the language of which is very, very different to what my kid binge watches on her iPad after summer camp. She is watching primarily shows from the last 10 years, and just the idea of her sitting down to watch black and white, shot in a studio the size of a shoebox, all one take with all the flubs kept in out of necessity, it seems like it's a whole new language for today's kids to learn. That is not a knock on today's kids, just a reflection that most people aren't watching early 1960s black and white live to tape anymore. And the other pitfall is that the books from that era, when you read them in sequence, they're wildly different in tone and in continuity. So, Unearthly Child has one introduction to the TARDIS crew. The very next story, The Daleks, has a very different introduction to the same characters. And then you have books that are very short and user friendly, like Terrence's adaptation of Planet of Giants. But right before that, you have something violent and visceral and gritty, like Ian Marter's The Reign of Terror. So, how does your show and how do your kids take that into account?
It's it is always when you read the book first, because that's what we do. We read the book first. It's always fun to see how it's adapted. It doesn't matter how old it is, and I think that's true at any age. And so, if they enjoy the book, it's very easy to get them to watch the show. And we watch one 24 episode a night, right? They cannot sit through the digest format of a Doctor Who episode. Absolutely not.
So you're not watching the old PBS 90-minute edit, for example.
Right, not the version that I grew up watching and falling asleep to at like 11:30 or something like that. But they love catching the things that are different because they love to be the ones that point that out in the podcast when I can't think of it. Right, it's almost a competition for them. But yeah, you start with the book, and the other thing I did, which was kind of sneaky, is like as they were growing up, I didn't let them watch Doctor Who. And I said, "Oh no, 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 you're too young for this. Like this is way too grown up for you. You can't watch this." And of course, that just like makes them want to watch it more. Um, and so that was a lot easier for them to get into it. Um, for the second one, the variety is actually what makes it more fun. I think is having the books be so different. And I do cater the books to each because I only make one of the kids read each book. Right? I have them. I alternate. I don't have them both on. And so
Ah.
if it's a historical, I know the older one loves the historicals, and the younger one has called dibs on all the Dalek books because she loves the Daleks. And if I think it's a little more on the violent side, I go with the older one. Um, the younger one got very emotional at the end of Dalek Invasion of Earth when Susan left, which she does not see coming. I'm very careful not to give them any idea what episodes I think or the fans think are good and bad. I want to hear what they think, like, in a vacuum first. So every episode starts with us rating the episode, and then we talk about things that are different. And then ultimately we sort of try to answer the question, like, if someone has already watched the episode, is this book worth reading? And I think there's some which you can pass because it's a transcript of the episode, and there's some that add a lot. And I think there's a few that are better. I like there's I will. I know I'm outside the mainstream. I've never been a fan of the Romans. I would take the book over the episode. I adore that book. It drops my least favorite part of the episode, and it adds in my favorite part of the story at the very end. I don't want to spoil anything, but that's one of the ones where I'll take the book over the episode. And I think it's a must read if you love that episode.
See, the Romans is one of those. There's a very small handful of Target books that I've only read once. I'm not positive that I've ever finished Ian Marter slash Nigel Robinson's version of The Rescue, for example. That came out when I was at a low ebb in my fandom. And I've done various partial rereads of the entire Target line over the years, but I don't think I've ever read that all the way through. The Romans, I know I bought it, and I know my copy still has the Barnes and Noble price sticker from when it came out. But when I read it, and I was still a teenager at that point, and I was very fussy about the books, the epistolary format and the humor in the book was so different to what was on television that I didn't enjoy it. And I probably have not read that in over 30 years. Now that I'm older, and now that I'm sure the literary references I will understand in a way I would not have done when I was 16, I am sure that I will love it. But again, it's about 2 years down the road for this show, so I'm just going to wait until I come to it. And I'm very curious to see if I will enjoy that more than I did back in 1980, whatever it was.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. It is. I mean, the very characters that are critical to the story are completely different in the books as well. Some characters essentially get dropped because, like you said, it's from a narrative format from each character, and they only pick a few of the characters who get to tell the story from their point of view. And Vicky's not one of them, right? So Vicky really gets the short end of the stick, and so does Barbara, I think. Something else I do with the kids to sort of keep them engaged with it is, like, I'll do a little prep work, especially on the historicals, right? So we'll watch some YouTube videos on the history of the Roman Empire, so they're not going in blind, right? Because there's an expectation there that you sort of have some understanding of what that is and who Nero is and who these characters are and how things worked. And um, so I think that's another thing important if you're trying to sort of get kids into these stories.
That's a really good point. I have not had that much success with my own. She did read the first chapter of Unearthly Child, but at this point, her reading level is already above that, and the stuff that she's reading is a lot more interesting than two school teachers chatting away in a lab. So I hold out hope that one day she'll inherit my collection and fall for it the way that I did, but that ship may have sailed on my end. But how often do you do an episode? How often do you read the book or show your kids the TV stories?
I mean, I try to do one a month. It depends on which one's it depends on which one's doing it too. The younger one's a little slower than the older one. The older one will read it in a day. It's like she's the same as you just said. She's already a little past them. The younger one, not quite. And so, like, I can't imagine doing the whole series, right? Because they're like, there's just so many books. They're going to outgrow them before you can finish them all.
Also, just by numbers, if you're talking about 160 books and you're doing one a month, that's more
Yes.
than 10 years in the project. And by then you'll have,
Hopefully they'll be out of the house at that point. Like, hopefully we're doing it over. Hopefully we're doing it over Zencaster. But I am going to stick with it. Like, this is my last pilgrimage. Um, I'm going to read every single book and then watch the episode after it, and that's probably the last time I'll ever do this in order.
Yeah, I told myself that when they announced in 2003 that RTD was going to make the new series, I did one final farewell tour of the classic series out of order, doing one episode every Saturday night. And I thought I was going to be saying goodbye to these episodes forever. And of course, I was 100% wrong. So hopefully you're wrong too, and hopefully you're not done with these books forever. But
I mean, it's going to take me a lot longer than I think. I'm a lot slower than you are, so it could I could be an old person by the time I get through this one.
yeah, thanks to the pandemic, I was able to watch the entirety of the classic series in 13 or 14 months between late 2020 and late 2021. Now that I'm back in the office several days a week, I don't foresee myself ever getting through the classic series again that fast.
Yeah, and I also want to do a complete. I'm also in the middle of a complete beginning of end reading of all of the um, Wilderness Years novels. So I'm 12 into the Virgin New Adventures, and I'm going to do all of those in order, and then I'm going to do all of the Eighth Doctor and Missing Adventures in order. And so that's that by the time I'm done with those two pilgrimages, that could be the end. like
Yeah, that could take you through the rest of your expected lifespan, unless you're going to regenerate.
at least into retirement.
So, when did you become a Doctor Who fan, Leland, and how did you watch the show, assuming you grew up in Southern California?
I didn't grow up in Southern California. It was actually rural Ohio, and we were lucky enough to live near a PBS station that showed the digest episodes once a week. And when you're showing the digest episodes once a week, you get through them very, very quickly, right? It's you get through a season in a couple of months.
I went to law school in Northwest Ohio, and this was the mid to late 90s. And the first thing I did when I got my cable was look for a PBS station showing Doctor Who, and at that point I couldn't find any. What
Yeah,
station were you on at the time?
I don't remember the station, but the reason you didn't find it is maybe because my station stopped airing Doctor Who shortly after it was canceled. So it
Oh,
was
wow.
only in syndication while new episodes were coming out. Um, I was also lucky because a lot of PBS stations they'd show the newer episodes and then they would show Tom Baker and then they would show the new episodes and then show the Tom Baker. And so a lot of just because you were near a PBS station that showed Doctor Who doesn't mean you had any exposure to the black and white episodes or anything like that. I was very lucky. I have a lot of not a lot. I have some childhood memories of the Hartnell era, and I'm really young, right? I'm 5. I'm 4. I'm 7 years old, something like that. I think I'm 9 when the show's canceled, and so like very, very, very young age. Um, and then came to California. Did not have it airing locally in California on PBS. Surprisingly, neither one of the PBS stations here aired it. And so sort of had a very long period where I didn't have any Doctor Who until sort of the Suncoast video age of Doctor Who, where I was buying sort of the VHS tapes from the mall.
Yes, I remember it well.
Yeah, and then of course got into the novels in a big way, and then that goes right into the new series. But the Target novelizations, tragically, I was completely unaware of. The
Really?
first time I ever laid eyes on a Target novelization, I was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, at a used bookstore, and I asked the guy if he had any Doctor Who books because I'm looking for Virgin Missing Adventures, which means we're in the mid 90s at this point. And he's like, "Yeah, I got 100 Doctor Who books." And I start to freak out because I'm like, "Oh, I'm going to find all of them. I'm going to get all the ones." And I go back, and it's he's got 100 Target novelizations that I've never seen before.
What is your reaction when you see 100 Doctor Who books that you didn't even know existed? Were you just tempted to just buy the whole kit and caboodle all at once?
No, I hate to say it was the opposite because again, I'm already collecting them on video, and I didn't feel like I had any need to read the episodes if I could watch them. At this point, I'm probably not really aware of the lost episodes, right? I probably would have bought every single missing episode novelization they had if I had known. But no, I was so addicted to sort of the news stories and the missing adventures and the full length novels, right? The targets are a lot smaller, and it was pretty obvious perusing them that these were fairly straightforward novelizations of the stories to serve a time prior to syndication and prior to home entertainment. And it actually wasn't until I met people at Gallifrey One that I realized that these were like to basically everyone else my age or older, that these were a huge deal. Like these were how people consumed Doctor Who, like in the 70s and 80s. when you did not have ready access to the episodes. Like everyone but me at Gallifrey One has read these as a kid. So I'm very unusual in that way, and it's just because I just never came across them. Right, like they never, there's no internet.
That's true. Just to relate to that in 2 points, for me, I started collecting the books in early 1985, and about 9 months later, my PBS station, well, one of them, I should say, in the New York area, got the Hartnell package. And New Jersey Network, which was kind of the hub for Doctor Who fandom in the Northeast, made a 30-minute special introducing the first and second Doctor stories. So they had their Doctor Who expert, Patrick Daniel O'Neill, and they had one of their PBS station hosts do a half-hour interview show where they named all the Hartnell and Troughton episodes they were going to be showing as part of that package. And then they showed clips from Unearthly Child and The Crotons and maybe a couple of others. And I videotaped that 25-minute segment and I just watched it over and over again. Because I had been into the novelizations for almost a year at this point, and I'd already read novelizations of some Hartnell stories that I did not know were missing, like Marco Polo. So when they listed the 17 Hartnell serials and the 5 Troughton serials, I'm like, where are the rest? When are they going to show Evil of the Daleks? When are they going to show Marco Polo? And that was how I learned that a lot of this stuff was just gone.
And how did that feel? Because I remember the day that I realized how many episodes were missing and how unlikely they were to ever be found.
I bought Doctor Who, or I had bought for me Doctor Who: A Celebration probably a couple months after that, and that, which came out in '83, had the list of which episodes were still extant from which stories. And that's when I realized, wow, I'm never going to see 10th Planet Part 4. I'm never going to see, Galaxy 4 or whatever, just to pick a random example. So in the early 90s, when I got to college and I joined Rekar's Doctor Who, somebody was talking about watching Part 4 of The Celestial Toymaker, which starred the guy who was the voice of Penfold in Danger Mouse, which I was very familiar with here in the States. That was a staple on Nickelodeon in the late 80s for years and years and years. So I'm like, wait a minute, how did you get to watch Celestial Toymaker 4? I thought it didn't exist. That's what I learned about the Hartnell Years VHS and the Troughton Years VHS. So my college roommate and I got on the bus that weekend and went down to the Baltimore's Inner Harbor, and they had the Gallery Mall across the street from Harbor Place. And on, I guess, the top floor of the Gallery Mall, they had a Suncoast Video, and I head straight to the sci-fi shelves, and there are 4 Doctor Who VHS tapes, all containing missing stories or fragments of missing stories, the orphan episodes that I didn't know I'd ever get a chance to see. So I was able to see Tomb of the Cybermen, which had just come out, and the Dalek early years, and the Cyberman years, and the Hartnell and Troughton years. So I spent like $85 on my credit card. That was probably 2 weeks' salary from my work study job. And I just carried an armload of those tapes back to the dorm. And at this point, this is the early 90s, there was one dorm TV and there was one dorm VCR, and that was how you watched it. So if you're going to plug in Tomb of the Cybermen, you're going to have 25, 19-year-old guys watching with you. And the reactions to some of the special effects in Tomb of the Cybermen in a college dorm in 1993, I wish I had videotaped the room rather than watching the videotape. It was priceless, but lots and lots of laughter, not all of it kind-hearted. But yeah,
Yes,
dropping $90 on those VHS
they
tapes,
were
which I
so
hadn't
they
even
were so expensive. They were all expensive.
$20 a piece.
And then I had just a huge box of them at 10 years later when the DVDs are coming out. It's like ugh. But yeah, I remember rushing out and buying Tomb of the Cybermen as soon as I could.
So coming back to the books, you are confronted with this site in Tulsa of 100 novelizations, and if I were you, I probably would have somehow found a way to bring every single one of those home. I suspect. I don't believe that I have the level of self-control that you had. When did you start collecting the books? When did you start reading the books?
The Target novelizations, literally, as we started doing this podcast,
So you're
um,
reading them for the first time then?
I'm reading for the very first time.
Wow.
The Virgin novels and the Eighth Doctor novels, more or less concurrently as they were being released, maybe a little behind. Um, but yes, I just it was the combination of needing something to read with my kids and like everyone at Gallifrey One talking about these books that those things combine. Like I was always kind of looking for a reason to read them, and as soon as I got or made up a reason, I started reading them.
See, the way that I see it, the New Adventures and the Eighth Doctor Adventures, and then, of course, to an even greater extent, the Missing and Past Doctor Adventures, those are book lines that are very much in conversation with the target novelizations. Those are primarily authors who grew up in the 70s and came of age with the novelizations. So there are lots of references to the target books in the NAs and the MAs, etc. And if you read a book like Blood Heat, which is Jim Mortimer's pseudo sequel to the Silurians, among other stories, that is a sequel to the novelization Doctor Who and the Cave Monsters more than it is a sequel to the TV episode Doctor Who and the Silurians. So I think if you go back and reread certain of the uh, 1990s and early 2000s books after you finish the Target books, I think you will see a whole other level of fandom on display because for that generation of author, the Target books were king, and everything they were doing was an extension of their having read Target books. It was Paul Mars, I think, who said in his afterword to the Scarlet Empress, you could tell who was a Doctor Who fan because anybody who used the word capacious had to have been a Doctor Who fan. Because the only way anybody learns that word is from Malcolm Hulke's or Terrence Dicks's books.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to like do that research to make sure I'm reading these books in the right order because I don't think I'm going to finish all the targets and then do the reread of the New Adventures. I'm sort of doing them concurrently. Um, yeah, one of the other things like I've heard that the novelization of Ghostlight adds quite a bit that was sort of left out. And that's always been a favorite story of mine, and so I've always had that on my list to read. And now I don't know if I can wait that long to do that in order. Like I may skip ahead, like I did here.
I think about half of the McCoy books add a tremendous amount of value to the TV episodes. Uh, Three-quarters of the season 26 books add a lot more. So Battlefield, Ghostlight, Curse of Fenric are positively brimming and overflowing compared to the TV productions. Survival does add some deleted scenes, but they're all nasty and nihilistic. So I'm more partial to the other three. But yeah, once you get to the McCoy era, the early 90s, the books were kind of regenerating because at this point, Virgin Publishing had already bought out Target. So at this point, the novelizations were slowly beginning their regeneration into the first of the new adventures. And that is a fun journey to watch. So this is then the first time that you've read Face of Evil, the novelization.
Yes,
So let's talk then about the TV episode. When did you first see it? What do you think of it?
I definitely have memories of watching it as a kid. Um, Tom Baker's giant face at the end of episode 3, right? With sort of like shouting at Caleb when he's shooting the laser gun is something that I don't, for whatever reason, things stick with you when you watch them as a kid and other things don't. And that's just one that like I never forgot that. I forgot that it was Leela's first episode, right? But I never forgot that effect. Um, and and the fact that the episode like makes Tom Baker's voice a character, right? Like you immediately know in that very first scene, which is actually you don't catch that in the novel, right? In the novel, when Neva is talking to Zoanan for the first time, doesn't say anything about the fact that Zoanan sounds like Tom Baker, whereas you do see that in the episode, and you immediately know something is up. There's no mistaking who that voice is.
I'll be talking about that a little more in the back half of the episode, for which I'm writing my script this week. Terrence does some interesting things to delay the revelation of who Zoan is, because you can do that in the book. You can never hide the fact that it's Tom Baker's voice, but in the book, Neva hasn't met the Doctor yet, so he wouldn't know that it's Tom Baker's voice. So
Right.
Terrence is able to play around with the narrative in ways like that.
Yeah. It the other thing that is like so Terrence Dicks is sort of giving us that explanation of exactly when in continuity Tom Baker sort of came here and caused all this trouble, right? Like That is a very Terrence Dicks thing to do, is to cross those T's.
and taking credit for it by placing the story within his own novelization of Robot.
Yeah. Yeah, it other than those two things, like it's a fairly straightforward adaptation. Like you can't criticize these books for not being what you want them to be in 2022, right? But this story, I think certainly more than any I've read thus far, which hasn't been that many, like this story is begging for more. Like this book could have been twice as long. There is so much you could add here, especially with this being Leela's first story. Like the episode kicks off, like I think literally in like the first minute, where she tells her entire tribe that their god's not real, and you don't know what leads up to that point. You don't know what sort of is setting her apart, other than that she's going to be the new companion, so she has to be awesome. But that would have been, um, you could have gotten a lot more backstory there. You could have sort of made a little more of the fact that her father dies, like, and then is essentially not mentioned again the entire story.
That, and I'll talk about this because you're anticipating a lot of my script notes for the second half of the show. That's got to be on the fault of Chris Boucher, if not necessarily the script editor, who should have said, no, go back and weave this in a little more. But there's nothing in the script for Terrence to lean on. There's no scene. Like in Tomb of the Cybermen, Victoria has this amazing scene written by the script editor, which talks about Victoria missing her father who had perished in the previous story. That's how you do it. And Chris Boucher, by extension, Robert Holmes, don't do that. So if Terrence were to even write a paragraph talking about how Leela feels with her father having been killed in service to a false god, that would have been nice, but there's no room in the scripts that he's adapting. He would have had to give that a little bit extra. And I
Yes.
guess it's so poorly handled in the script that he just felt he couldn't salvage it with a single paragraph, so why even bother?
Yeah, I think you're right. Like I don't think a single paragraph does it. I think if you're going to do it, you just remove it. I actually don't think it adds a lot to the story. I think certainly watching the episode, the fear of whatever the Horta is so palpable. Um, I don't think it's necessary to have someone scream off screen to sort of like she would rather face exile, which is almost certain death, than take this test. That's something else I think the book does a lot better. Like what exactly the test of the Horta is and like what makes it difficult doesn't really come through on screen. But in the book, he sort of explains very clearly sort of this tension on when to fire and because you never know when that thing under you is going to break, and that's what doesn't come through on screen very well.
And he also gives the doctor an extra bit of jeopardy because as he's coming off the plank starts to break and he has to take a flying leap to the other side,
Oh,
which is
that's right.
not staged. It's not staged. I went back and I watched that clip when I was putting together my audio clip selections for this episode. It's not there on TV. Terrence did add that himself.
That is the exact kind of thing my kids would catch and make fun of me for missing.
That's the kind of thing Mikey would make fun of me for catching. But have you read? Because Chris Boucher wrote 4 novels for the past Doctor's Adventure line, starting in 1999 and then going all the way up through the. He wrote one of the last of the PDAs, probably 2004, maybe early 2005. I forget the timing. So he wrote 4 books with Leela and the Fourth Doctor, and this is the guy who created. He wrote 3 stories for the Tom Baker era, all with Leela. You figure that he is going to be the best author of them all. Have you read any of his 4 books?
I know that I read Corpse Marker, but I can't remember anything about it, and I don't think I read any of the others.
I find his prose to not be very captivating. I've read all 4 of his books now. The last one was Match of the Day, which I just read last year when I was doing my season 15 pilgrimage. This is almost exactly 12 months ago. He writes very long scenes with very few breaks, and his prose is not especially sparkly. This is a question that I'll ask the audience on the other side of this interview. Who would have done a better job novelizing the Chris Boucher scripts for Face of Evil? Terrence Dicks in 120 pages or Chris Boucher in 240? I'm not so sure that Terrence isn't the better version of the story, even though it's only half the length of what Boucher would have given us. I think Boucher's ideas and the dialogue is better than the story that he would have written in book form, but we'll never know. That's just a matter for debate. And Boucher's novels, for me, just don't land as well as elements of his best TV writing.
if we're just looking at the TV episodes, I do feel like he gets Leela in a way some of the other authors definitely didn't. Like some not authors, script writers. Like I definitely feel like Leela and occasionally falls into sort of the normal companion tropes of needing to be rescued, and that should never be what she is in an episode, right? Like that's a completely misunderstanding the character. And there's I think that's one thing that you definitely get on screen that you don't get in the novel is like there is like right away a chemistry between the actors, even though I understand that they actually didn't get along terribly until they were a bit further along in filming.
Yeah, there's the famous anecdote that she had to tear into him on the set of Horror of Fang Rock because he was walking over her lines and wasn't letting her act, and she finally had to call him out in front of everybody. At which point they started getting along famously, and now Tom
Yes,
Baker, of course, 40 years on, is very apologetic about that.
yes, but I mean, even in this first episode, like the characters work so well together when he's writing them, and that's definitely not the case in every story.
And the secret sauce is Louise Jameson. You talk about the best actors who play companions. Leela is kind of a thankless role. If we're going to be very reductionist, she is just there to be an Amazon girl. She is there to show off her legs. She's not necessarily there to be a full blown character in her own right. She's basically there as marketing. As John Nathan Turner would say in the mid 80s, she's there for the dads.
Ugh,
Louise
yes,
Jameson never misses an opportunity to get into that character's head and give more on screen than you get in the script. And she takes that questionable idea for a character and makes it the most interesting possible performance in the world. So much of the credit goes to Louise Jameson. I really can't praise her enough for this work she did for a year and a half on a low budget TV show.
yes. I mean, there's a reason they tried to get her back, right? Didn't they try to get her back for 19?
Yeah, I think they tried to get her back for that 3 episode arc bridging Tom Baker to Peter Davison. They also tried Elizabeth Sladen. I may be misremembering that, but I know I've read it on the DVD captions. And I think they wanted her to stay around for another year too. I don't think they didn't want her leaving with Invasion of Time. I think they delayed writing her out because they were hoping she would change her mind, if memory serves me right.
Oh, that would explain why the exit is so awkward.
Exactly.
Android is, you know, I mean, Doctor Who. I think you could say has occasionally, um, in its portray of native peoples, like we see this tribe, this primitive tribe, which actually isn't right. It's these descendants of these crests, these this crashed crew. Like, do you think this falls into any of those tropes, or do you think it gets around it because it's actually not sort of a native people and it is sort of these people who have been controlled by this supercomputer?
I think that the Seva team are a lot more interesting than the Tesh. And I think when you get to that pivot in part 3 where the story becomes the story of the Tesh rather than the story of the Seva team, the story does lose a lot of oxygen. The best performers in the cast disappear. One of them is killed off at the end of part 2. David Garfield, who is probably the best thing about the story, is barely in part 3 at all. So I think that the Seva team are more interesting. Even though they're a cliche, it's an interesting cliche because they're surrounded by technological remnants. On the DVD production notes, it's mentioned that this story is almost a riff on Harry Harrison's Captive Universe. When the DVD came out for the first time, probably at least a decade ago, I immediately went to Forbidden Planet in New York, which had at the time a used book section, and I actually found like a $2 copy of Captive Universe, which is if you don't want to be spoiled for Captive Universe, please fast forward about 60 seconds. It is a colony ship story, and they've created 2 tribes of warriors living in a simulacrum of Aztec Mexico. And the 2 tribes live across a river, and they're never supposed to meet. But the idea is eventually the two tribes will start interbreeding and creating these genius children who will take over the ship and fly to its final destination. So once you see that, Face of Evil becomes the adaptation of the classic sci-fi trope rather than an original story in its own right. What interests me more is the religion. This is a very, very fiercely anti-religion story. And Boucher's original title, "The Day the God Went Mad," I think is a lot more interesting than Face of Evil. So that's the part of the story that I gravitate towards, rather than the grimy savages running around an indoor jungle set for parts one and part two. If that answers your question.
Yeah, the if this were a story of this ship with this crew that had crashed and these native people that had been on the planet before then, I think they would have been portrayed as more superstitious than they were. As they're portrayed now, like they're all skeptical. Like what makes Leela special is that she's willing to say it. But Andor is very skeptical. Caleb essentially doesn't believe any of this. Thomas is skeptical. Like they're all skeptical. And they actually have less reason to be skeptical because their God is real. He is talking to them. He is telling them when the door's going to open, right? Like there is evidence there, but they know something's not right. But it's just about no one has the political courage to actually say so, right? Except
Because
Leela.
when Leela does, she gets expelled, right?
Yeah,
Or her father gets thrown to the Horta.
yeah. I mean, this episode has the line, like maybe the most famous line for people who haven't seen Doctor Who, which is the line that the very powerful and the very stupid have something in common, which is they change the facts to fit their views. They don't change the views to fit their facts. A line that I feel is almost wasted in the episode. Like he's just making conversation while he's working on something, and I don't even know that it actually kind of fits the story at that time. Because at that time, I think Neva's like already breaking, and if he's talking about Jabel, is Jabel stupid or is Jabel powerful? I'm not sure which one he's trying. I don't know what he's trying to say in that thing. But that I can think of so many more Doctor Who stories where that line would have been more relevant to the plot at hand. Whereas here, it just feels like the Fourth Doctor's making conversation with Leela.
There's another passage also around that part of the story that's very good that doesn't get the same meme treatment, but let me read it out to you. This is page 103, top of page 104. Neva came forward to join them, staring intently at the rocket ship. He began reciting from the litany. The gates of paradise shall be opened to the people of Zoannon, and his dwelling place revealed. Tomas looked sharply at him. We've outgrown the old superstitions, Neva. I guess you could call him doubting Tomas at that point. But it's there, isn't it, Tomas, said Neva. We start getting proof and we stop believing. Next line. When there's proof, you don't need to believe. That's also the core of the story right there, as told through a bunch of secondary and tertiary characters.
Yeah, I mean, somewhat related to that, Thomas is really gets done dirty in the novel because the novel goes into what he's thinking when Leela is facing exile, and
Right?
he literally says to himself, he's like, I like this girl, but there are other girls in the tribe. I don't feel the need to stand up and sort of speak my mind and stand behind her when she's making this stand, right? And and so yeah, it's easy to say that when you're staring at the thing. Um, I think Neva's heel turn at the end, you almost miss it because there's that line when the doctor's talking to him on the radio and he's pretending to be Zoan, and at the very end, Neva refers to him as Doctor. And if you don't catch that, if you don't catch what happened there, him turning against Zoan doesn't really make any sense. And actually, I think that's one of the benefits of sort of reading the novel and then watching the story and sort of back to back. It's like you don't miss it that you don't miss it in the novel.
In fact, Terrence makes clear something that is not very well portrayed on screen. See, when I was a kid watching these, my PBS station aired them one episode a night, 25 minutes from 7 o'clock to 7:25 Monday to Friday. And I missed part one of Face of Evil for whatever reason, but I was able to watch parts two, three, and four. And I was hooked on David Garfield's performance as Neva. He's a memorable looking character. He makes some really interesting acting choices that elevate the story that are not present in the draft scripts. And when he's killed off at the end of part four, I was upset. He's one of those characters I wanted to survive. These episodes often cast an interesting moral judgment in the 70s as to who lives and who dies at the end of part four. I was
Yes.
rooting for Neva to make it, and of course he doesn't. But it's not made clear on TV. It's much clearer in the book. His death is the moment that allows the Doctor to win through, because when he distracts Zoannan, all the other mind controlled 17
Yes.
Tesh suddenly blank out for a minute, and that allows the Doctor to jam in the plug and flip the switch that will solve the story.
Yes. And it doesn't make sense either, right? Because he's in the show, he's shooting a screen in a hallway. That's not the computer. We've seen the computer room at this point, right? He doesn't even go into the room that we know is the which the doctor calls the holiest of holies, which was great. Like, if he were in that room, it would make even a little more sense, right? But it actually, yes, the that is, you're absolutely right. That would be very easy to miss if you didn't catch that in the book.
I think it's established elsewhere in the story obliquely that Zoannan has telekinetic powers, like he's able to have the invisible Forbidden Planet style beasts stalking the jungle, harking back to Planet of Evil a season earlier. So that would be the explanation as to why a door is able to generate a power beam that's strong enough to disintegrate Neva. But again, it doesn't make a lot of sense unless you think through that Zoan does have these powers. But otherwise, it is an odd way for the character to go.
Yeah, I mean, he more than anyone else should be sort of forced to live with the knowledge that he's been wrong the whole time and been leading the tribe in the wrong direction the whole time, right? Like you said, like there's a value judgment there. All the skeptics live, right? Andor and Neva are probably Neva's the true believer. Andor's pretty close. They both die off, and it's Thomas and Caleb um, who get to, and hey, it's probably Caleb, like the worst. By the way, a particularly violent episode too. Like there are 4 deaths in the first episode, and and the doctor doesn't bother to lecture Leela about murder until the second person she kills. Like the first person is like, and then the second time she does it, he's like, okay, this is becoming a pattern. We need to talk about this.
I had this whole thing ready to go in my script for the second half of this episode, talking about how Andor is a terrible leader and he's indecisive, and that's why his name is And Or, because he can't make up his mind.
Is that true, or is that just a coincidence?
I don't know. That's my headcanon. Except
Yeah.
2 days ago, in real time, you and I are talking on the Wednesday evening. Disney Plus dropped the trailer for Star Wars Andor, which is the Diego Luna prequel to Rogue One, starring
Yes.
Cassian Andor, and it's going to be a 2-season series. And now Andor is a much better sci-fi name than it is in Face of Evil, because now you think of, the original Star Wars rebel, the guy who began the chain of events that took down the Empire, the guy without whom Episode 4 never happens, Cassian Andor. So the name now has a very different meaning than it did 48 hours ago.
Yeah, man. I mean, are there is there any crumb of space that they're not going to scrape in those Star Wars TV shows? Like they're gonna do everything. Like they're gonna tell every character's story. They've already That's already going to be 2 seasons, huh?
Yeah, people online are already calling it Rogue Zero as the prequel to Rogue One.
Like at some point, this whole thing has gone from being sort of an addiction to prequels to almost a fear of sequels. Like Star Trek has made prequel after prequel after prequel since sort of the Next Generation DS9 like Voyager era, right? And Game of Thrones is premiering with Matt Smith like this
That's
week,
right.
and I it's just it's there's you always have to overcome the fact that how this character's fate ends, right? Better Call Saul's coming to an end in 2 weeks, and it's
Don't
it
remind me. I'm going to be very, very sad. That show is my spirit animal.
yeah, and it the way you escape that is you introduce characters who were not in the original thing, whose fates you don't know, right? And that is what gets you hooked. And the 2 best characters on that show are the characters that we didn't see in the original.
And that's why Better Call Saul is better than Breaking Bad, because Breaking Bad doesn't have Kim Wexler in it.
Yep,
And
exactly.
when you go back and watch it now, there is a big Kim Wexler shaped hole where Kim Wexler should be. Rhea Seahorn needs to call me, by the way. Rhea, if you're out there, Rhea,
Yeah,
guess she's not
I
out there.
mean, by the time this airs, it'll have already been happened. But I hope it's. I hope we haven't seen the last of that character. There's only 2 episodes left.
There was, and we're talking about the episode that aired on August 1st, there was the scene from a distance where Gene is standing in the phone booth in Nebraska talking to what we believe is Kim long distance in Florida. And all you see is him shouting from a distance, and you can't hear what he's saying, and he's ends up smashing the phone against the receiver and kicking a hole in the glass door. One of my friends said that in the German version of the episode actually added subtitles for what Gene was saying, and it's very interesting. I just don't know if that's canonical or if that's
Oh
an invention
no!
of the German captioners.
Oh, I don't want to. I don't think I want to know.
Yeah, I will leave that as a mystery. According to the producers interviewed on Entertainment Weekly, we're going to see the other side of that scene possibly in the next 2 weeks. So maybe we haven't seen the
Oh,
last of
interesting.
Ms. Wexler. My problem with the Star Wars prequels is this, and I realize I run the risk of losing half my audience right now, which I can ill afford. My problem with the prequels, my problem with the Book of Boba Fett, which was kind of, I guess that's a sequel and a prequel at the same time, and my problem to a lesser degree with Kenobi, is they're not so much interested as telling new stories. They're interested in filling the gaps that we didn't need filled, and more than that, they're addicted to showing off droids and props and sound effects from 1977. Almost all the emotional joy in watching Book of Boba Fett and watching Kenobi is seeing these characters and one-off props and sound effects again. Like if there had been a second solo movie, Bosk was going to be a major character. Bosk, of course, is in half a second of Empire Strikes Back and is better known as an action figure. But they were going to take this one-off background character.
Is that the lizard? Is that the lizard bounty hunter? Is that the lizard bounty hunter that's standing next to Boba Fett?
Yep, that's the
Yeah.
two-legged
Okay.
iguana who hisses at the camera.
Yeah.
But they're addicted to taking these props and sound effects and turning them into the story. That's not necessarily how you make great. You can make great fiction, but almost by accident. You're better off having a good story.
Yeah. Do you think? I mean, Russell T Davies had this, this one line in an interview about how, you know, the Marvel mega franchise spanning out across TV and movies and stuff like that, and he felt like, he said something like, "Man, I was showrunner of Doctor Who 10 years too early." And now he's the showrunner again, and everyone's like, "Oh man, we're going to get the Doctor Who expanded universe. We're going to get the Doctor Who version of Civil War, where there's going to be 4 doctors going against you." Like, do you think there's any chance of this happening, or is this just wishful thinking? Like, because my attitude is your flagship needs to be extremely popular to launch the spinoffs, and I don't feel like we're there right now. Right? I feel like we need the show that's airing to be better, and then sort of, you know put in the effort in the secondary characters and the reoccurring characters in the villains, which I think is going to necessitate like less focus on monsters and more focus on characters, so that you have this universe that you can potentially play around in.
Well, he did have, he had the Sarah Jane Adventures for the younger viewers, and he had Torchwood for the older viewers. And then all the three of those series are airing at once. Sarah Jane Adventures was probably the best of those three series for a large portion of it. Um, if you were to do it now, I think RTD has the money and the resources that he didn't have in 2007 because now he has the combined weight of Bad Wolf and Sony and HBO Max behind him, which is how you can get Neil Patrick Harris playing what we believe is a returning 1960s Doctor Who villain, filming stuff for the next special.
He instantly becomes the most recognizable guest actor on Doctor Who, right?
At least for the American audience, certainly.
Yeah.
The Doctor Who show had a discussion of this recently. Who are the biggest guest stars in Doctor Who? You had George Coulouris in Keys of Marinus. He was in freaking Citizen Kane, and there he is in a one-off role in Doctor Who in 1964. That was a pretty big get. And you've had other big-name actors over the years. For Americans, Neil Patrick Harris will surpass Meredith Vieira as the biggest American performer ever to show up on Doctor Who.
Yeah, and I think for modern audiences, oh my gosh, I've forgotten her name. David Tennant Christmas special, Titanic.
Oh, Kylie Minogue.
Yes, I think probably Kylie Minogue is owns that slot right now. But yeah, it's I'm trying to avoid spoilers as best I can, and I'm still really. I mean, my expectation for a 60th anniversary is a multi-doctor story, and so I'm going to do my best to come in with neutral expectations, but it's very hard. It's very hard, right? Especially coming off the Jodie Whittaker era. Like more than anything else, I want Jodie Whittaker on screen next to David Tennant. It doesn't feel like it's in the cards, but anything could happen. Like everything we know right now is just from the scenes they had to film outdoors. Like, it, who knows what's happening behind on the stage, right? And so I'm trying to be positive. But I think a 60th anniversary without a multi doctor is a lost opportunity. It's because Doctor Who's been a victim of its own success in casting. Like we just talked about, like Matt Smith is in Game of Thrones this week.
Yeah.
Tennant is a megastar. Kieran
Karen
Gillan is
Gillan.
in all of the Marvel movies. Like it's
Yeah.
crazy, right? And so it's I mean, oh god, her name's escaping me. Sorry, but in Blink, Sally Sparrow instantly becomes one of the most beloved characters in the franchise in 45 minutes, and then the actress goes on to win an Oscar and instantly becomes too big for Doctor Who.
Yeah.
Like,
RTD did the same thing. RTD had Andrew Garfield before he was Andrew Garfield. He had Felicity
yes,
Jones before she was Felicity Jones. Now you go back and watch 15 years later, you have these amazing actors who have multiple pieces of hardware. Any prestige project is going to have Andrew Garfield or Felicity Jones in it. RTD got them first.
yeah, Olivia Coleman in a forget. I mean, I think even big Doctor Who fans forget that she was in the first Matt Smith episode. Like it's crazy. Yeah, it's crazy. So I think it's really hard to do a multi-doctor story when they're all as big as they are. And I think to do it, it's got to be a one-off, and it's got to be kind of an anniversary thing, and it's got to be something that's going to generate. Any anniversary special is going to generate a lot of press, and it's going to generate a lot of excitement.
I think the Five Doctors has an argument as being the greatest Doctor Who story of all time for the classic series. I'm waiting for the new series version of the Five Doctors. I don't think Day of the Doctor quite cuts it, but I'm very much looking forward to it. I think RTD knows what he's doing. I think he has the funding. I think even though Doctor Who's brand is perhaps not as strong as the MCU's brand right now, to loop around to your original question, I think RTD has the ability to give us the Doctor Who multiverse and make it popular right now, rather than waiting 5 years for the series to renew itself. That is my hope. Of course, we'll revisit this episode in a couple of years and see if I was right.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully we have more than two episodes in the next couple of years, right? Like it is weird. It is weird knowing more about the 60th anniversary than we do know about the episode that's going to air in like 2 months from now.
We know that Chibnall is doing stuff that he's not telling us about. We know there are going to be spoilers and surprises that are not yet made public, the way that the two returning classic series companions were made public in the trailer.
Yeah,
So we'll find out. I just want a story where the Jodie Whittaker Doctor gets to act rather than react. Mostly her story
yeah,
arc has been standing in front of a green screen for 20 minutes while somebody talks to her and explains things to her that she didn't know. I want to see her being more of the story engine, and hopefully Chibnall has that ready to go. I want to see a story that also features Joe Martin a lot more heavily than she has been. I picture a story in parallel where Jodie is anchoring three-quarters of the story and Joe Martin is anchoring the B plot, and then the two converge at the very end and maybe have a joint regeneration. That's what I'd like to see, but Chibnall has his own ideas. He's not going to listen to me, and we'll see what he does.
I one of my other favorite podcasts, whose his name I can't remember, they have a great description of Jodie's delivery, which is it's a children's awards show presenter, like this sort of overly excited, kind of in a way that I think all the modern doctors have kind of done. Um, but yeah, I if Flux hadn't been impacted by COVID-19 and had been 10 episodes instead of six, I really think you might have gotten like an entire Joe Martin episode virtually an entire Joe Martin episode instead of what we got, which was like we got a Joe Martin episode, but it's Jodie Whittaker was standing in her place the whole time, which was so weird. It was,
Yeah.
and you would just cut to her when it was in a mirror, and it's like just if we're supposed to be watching the flashback with Joe Martin, just let Joe Martin play the Doctor in these scenes. But I think the fear there was like the season was so compacted. Are you really going to do a Doctor Light story in a 6 episode season? Um,
It's just criminal to give us the Joe Martin Doctor and then never use her. So that's got to be what a 90-minute, almost a double episode is for.
yes,
Intellectually, that's the answer. Of course, Chibnall doesn't always do things the way that we and fandom like to map them out.
I have to believe she's coming back. I mean, she's sort of critical to his era. Um, I his era like it kicked off in her first episode, right? That's the episode where everyone's like, okay, this is good. We need more of this. Were you at the galley right before the pandemic, where we all watched the Haunting of Via
Yes, I was.
Diodati?
I was there. I was sitting in the middle section of the seats, towards the front, in front of the cameras. So in the front half of the room.
I mean, electric, absolutely electric. Instant, like classic episode. Um, I, you know, I like this era almost more than anyone else, but that's not enough for me to sort of launch an intense defense of it, if you know what I mean. Like everyone who's very critical of it on Twitter, I can't say they're wrong. I can't disagree with anything they say. I'm just enjoying it more than other people are in a way that's harder to explain. And I'm gonna miss I'm going to miss sort of the potential, like, what if Flux had been 10 episodes? What if we had gotten another season? Um, like, what if they had sort of realized that Mandip Gill was really the star earlier and had gone all in on her earlier than they did? Um, but that's the game. It's the what if. That's why we have Big Finish.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll see most of those actors in Big Finish box sets a few years from now. So speaking of what if, I'm going to challenge you to a game,
All right.
and I'm going to ask, what if you can guess a
Oof.
Doctor Who story in 20 questions? I have picked off of the randomizer.net a single Doctor Who story from 1963 to 2022. You have 20 yes or no questions to guess which story I have picked. The record is guessing it in 7.
Ooh.
Nobody has failed yet. You have a choice of breaking the record or failing.
All right. So is it modern or is it classic? So is it a modern? Is it new Who?
No, it is not New Who.
All right. Is it black and white?
Yes, it is black and white. Question 3.
Is it a second Doctor story?
Yes, it is a second Doctor story. Question 4. You're off to a flying start.
Okay. That's a good hit rate, but it is also my the era that I'm most unfamiliar with. Is it a season 6 story?
No, it is not a season 6 story. Question 5.
Is it a season 4 story?
Yes, it is a season 4 story. Question 6.
All right, so I just got to get real lucky here. And the first 2 episodes of season 4 were Hartnell episodes.
If you're talking about production season 4 begins with 10th Planet. Televised season 4 starts with Smugglers.
Smugglers, yeah. Interesting. Okay. Trying to figure, like, my math brain is trying to figure out how to, like, ask a question that bisects season 4 without just saying, is it before or after this one? I can. Okay. Is it a Dalek episode?
It is not a Dalek episode. Question 7. This is your chance to tie the record if you want to take a wild guess.
Yeah, I think I'm down to just a handful of episodes. Okay, so Jamie's in one of those episodes. Is it the Makra Terror?
It is not the Macra
Ah,
Terror. We are
all
now
right.
on question 8.
Yeah. I think there's few enough episodes I can just start asking if they're the individual episodes. Is it the Moon Base?
It is not the Moonbase. Question 9.
Is it the Faceless Ones?
It is not the Faceless
Oh,
Ones.
so I'm
Question
gonna
10.
go. I'm gonna miss all of these. Is it the Highlanders?
It is not the Highlanders.
Oh, so it is the Underwater Menace.
Yes, ding, ding, ding. It
Jeez.
is the Underwater Menace.
Ugh.
Well, you got it. You did not fail. That's the good
Yeah.
news. And I am now going to reload the randomizer, and we will see what story comes up for the next guest on this podcast who plays that game. Oh, that's going to be an interesting one. I do not envy the person who has to guess the next story. So, Leland, thanks for coming on and talking about Face of Evil on your podcast and guessing the Underwater Menace, which is, by the way, a very, very underrated story. I say that in all seriousness. I like it better than the Dominators, much better than the Dominators. Where can we find you online?
I'm on Twitter, my full name. That's pretty much it. The podcast is called like Indoctrination because doctor and because I'm indoctrinating my kids, but it's like the third or fourth most popular podcast with that name. So, search your podcast service of choice and then scroll down. It's got a TARDIS icon. My kids love to get listener questions. We don't get very many, but that is their most favorite thing. So if you want to know like what an 8 or 10-year-old thinks about Doctor Who, please send us the questions. We do like a wrap up episode every season where we rank them all because Doctor Who fans, you have to rank the stuff.
All right, I will put a link to that in the show
Thank you.
notes. Leland, thanks very much for joining us. We'll do this again soon. Have a great night.
Thank you. Talk to you later.
Doctor Who and the Face of Evil, written by Terrance Dicks, televised as The Face of Evil, teleplay by Chris Boucher, televised in January 1977, published in January 1978. Setting the controls for Earth, the Doctor is surprised when the TARDIS lands in a primeval forest. Has the tracer gone wrong, or has some impulse deep in his unconscious mind directed him to this alien planet? In investigating the forest, the Doctor meets and assists Leela, a warrior banished from her tribe, the Sevateem. Through Leela, it gradually becomes apparent that the constant war between the Sevateem and the Tesh has been instigated by the god they both worship, Xoanan. Xoanan, an all-powerful computer, is possessed by a desperate madness, a madness that is directly related to Doctor Who that causes Xoanan to assume the voice and form of the Doctor, a madness that is partly caused by the Doctor, and that only the Doctor himself can rectify. The Doctor must not only do battle with Xoanan, but must also escape from the savage practices of the Sevateem and the technically mind-controlling destructive impulses of the Tesh. I'll admit, I walked into this book with low expectations, having established in previous episodes of the podcast that I'm generally in awe of Terrance Dicks' skills. This is a 120-page adaptation of what in my mind is a fair to middling Philip Hinchcliffe-era episode, but not one of my favorites, and I wasn't expecting to find much truth or poetry in the novelization of The Face of Evil. The opening paragraph is a single sentence. The Sevateem were holding a trial, which is not the best way into this story, perhaps. The fact that savages are holding a trial in what's clearly a spaceship, surrounded by tons of technological equipment, is the story. Inside the ruins of a once gleaming spaceship, a strange scene unfolded. A tribe of savages were holding a trial. Now that would have been great if Terrance had written it and not me just now. That opening, my opening, uses all of Terrance's favorite words at once. Gleaming, strange, savage. Instead, Terrance holds back the high-tech equipment reveal until page 23. Several characters are introduced all at once on page 1. Leela, our new companion. This is her second straight book, and she'd already been on TV for a year, so no surprise. But we also meet Caleb, Neva, Tomas, Soleil, and Andor, all on the same page. Neva is introduced with a string of capitalized modifiers. The shaman, witch doctor, speaker of the law. Caleb gets a great description. Quote, his handsome features marred by an air of cunning. Andor, a terminally dithering type whose name, and/or, tells you all you need to know about the character, that he can't make up his mind, and that he's not likely to make it through part 2, which he doesn't. Though hold on to that thought. Terrance will do something clever with him later. Though Terrance is getting busy here on page 1, or, because this is a Target book, page 7. Andor is properly introduced on the next page. Quote, He was a stocky man in his 50s, a grim, experienced warrior. He had fought his way to the throne by strength and ruthless cunning. There was no succession by right in the tribe of Sevatim. The shining throne, handed down from the old time, belonged to the man who could take it and keep it. Andor then undercuts his strong description by immediately passing on a command decision to someone else. Tomas also gets a good introduction. Terrence makes it clear that he's in love with Leela, something suggested by the actors on TV but not really made obvious in the script. Another sign of what tremendous work Louise Jameson did on TV, always working those scripts to give her performance every edge. If I seem a little ambivalent about the story that's being adapted, well, you'd be right. The core story is great. Hard sci-fi, a colony ship scenario on a mad computer, and as the Doctor later says, an experiment in eugenics. The execution, though, leaves me a bit dissatisfied. Pennant Roberts' directorial debut is better than some of his later 1980s efforts, although he's no David Maloney, no Rodney Bennett. And then Leela's father is killed in the very first scene, and this has no impact on her for the rest of the story. None. That's messed up. The Face of Evil is Chris Boucher's Doctor Who debut, and he's one of those indispensable names. Wrote 3 Doctor Who stories in 12 months, then basically ran Blake's 7 for the whole of its run, and did a ton of other TV work, including Star Cops, which got broadcast on PBS right after Doctor Who in the early 90s, of which I can only remember the opening theme song. Boucher then wrote 4 Doctor Who novels for the BBC Books line, the first of which, Last Man Running, was basically a reimagining of The Face of Evil. His prose style was alas a bit stodgy, and none of those 4 novels are as readable as Terrence's 120-page novelization here. Boucher's scripts and concepts are better than his supporting characters, although Face benefits from a strong cast of actors. Leslie Schofield, who filmed this immediately after filming Star Wars in 1976, and David Garfield are standouts. Terrence on page 12 provides his second eulogy and lamentation for the lost Sarah Jane Smith. Much more satisfactory than the 2 brief sentences we got in his previous novelization, Doctor Who and the Deadly Assassin, which we discussed here back in episode 36. Check this out. He, the Doctor, set off into the forest, then stopped with an obscure feeling of something missing. Of course, Sarah Jane Smith. She should have been beside him as usual, grumbling about their unexpected arrival in a strange destination, and the dangers they were sure to meet. The Doctor gave a rueful smile. Sarah was back on Earth now, like Harry Sullivan and the Brigadier. It had been the Doctor's own decision to take her back. Time Lord Law had prevented him from taking her to Gallifrey. Besides, it was more than time that she took up her own ordinary human life again. Yes, the Doctor decided. He'd acted for the best. But as he walked through the forest, he couldn't help feeling a little lonely. Chapter 2 opens with what sounds like a self-reviewing line that takes a run at another jungle set so soon after Terrence novelized Planet of Evil. The line is this: "The trouble with forests, decided the Doctor, is that they are undoubtedly rather monotonous. Terrence is happier when dealing with political struggles, so he has much more fun writing for Caleb." Page 21. There was no doubt in Caleb's mind as to who was going to be the new chief. Chapter 2 ends with the TV scene where we hear the Doctor's voice as Zoannon speaking to Neva, except Terrence again holds back the reveal, not telling us that this is the Doctor's voice, which makes sense in universe, as Neva hasn't met the Doctor at this point in the story and wouldn't put the 2 voices together. And for all my nitpicks, I really enjoy the way Terrence threads the mystery throughout the Part 1 material, chapters 1 through 4, as this is the odd 4-part story that Terrence turns into a 15-chapter book rather than a 12-chapter book. Every couple of pages he reminds us of the mystery of why the Sevatim have so much tech, and on page 33 informs us the gong was a sacred relic of the old time, and the faded lettering stamped along the bottom edge formed the words Survey Team 6, but no one in the tribe of Sevatim could read. That's a really effective line, and it's kind of the quintessential Terrence sentence. It's a short line, a short sentence, hardly any words more than 1 syllable, but it really packs a punch. The Doctor, from the moment that he arrives in the book, has an internal thought process that keeps nagging at him about unfinished business and about having been here before. the story's central mystery, and leading up to that really good Part 1 cliffhanger, where the Doctor sees his own face carved into the mountain as a depiction of the Evil One.
You know, I had a feeling that Neva was actually expected to hear an answer to his prayer.
There wouldn't be much point in praying if he didn't.
I could quote you a few theologians who give you an argument on that. He was listening. Hello? Intergalactic operator, hello? Over. Dead as a Dalek. Must be something.
Why did you talk to that tube?
I thought I recognized it.
Neva! Neva!
Well, Neva, hotline to God. Psst, don't be afraid. It's only a machine for sending voices over long distances. That may be Zoannan speaking, but it's not God. Gods don't use transceivers.
Are you certain?
Aren't you?
Yes.
That's better.
Neva! Neva!
I'm sorry, Neva isn't here at the moment. Could I take a message? Over.
At last we are here. At last. At last. Us.
Us?
You. Me. Us. We. At last I shall be free of us.
Who are you?
Don't I know?
Leela. I have a feeling. Something nasty. Something I did. It seems like it.
What are you talking about?
Who did that voice remind you of?
You. It was your voice. How could that be?
More to the point, who could that be?
It's in Chapter 5, when Terence finally reveals that the voice of Zoannan is also the voice of Tom Baker, a fact necessarily disclosed to TV audiences much earlier, in Part 1, but which Terence is able to delay until the Part 2 material. However, although Terence builds slowly up to all the reveals about the Seventh Team being the survey team, and Neva's holy relics all being bits of spacesuit and spaceship, his revelation about who is the voice of Zoannan, so to speak, is rather muted. One sentence, starting at the bottom of page 44. What surprised the Doctor was the fact that the voice he heard was his own! Exclamation point. And that's a revelation in mid-chapter, mid-scene. You figure that would have been worth at least a chapter ending. For a relatively slight book, Terence doesn't change the text much, until Chapter 5. Director Pennant Roberts prefers single scenes spread across multiple sets, with lots of voices being heard out of vision. Terence, probably working from scripts prepared before Roberts started mapping out camera moves, consolidates those sequences into single scenes. He mostly leaves the dialogue alone and adds only brief observations or asides. But in Chapter 5, he has Neva stoke the tribe into a frenzy before their futile attack on the Black Wall by reciting the litany previously heard in Part 1 and recorded for the book in Chapter 4. This re-recital does not happen on TV. Terence adds this presumably for narrative effect. And when the Doctor discovers that there's a, quote, hotline to God, close quote, on TV, Tom Baker delivers the line, poor old Neva. But in the book, Terence changes it to the much more satisfying, lucky old Neva. And to be fair to Andor, no, not Cassian Andor, whose Star Wars Limited TV series saw its trailer drop a few weeks ago, Terence does dip into his head for a single paragraph on page 46, an epic-length paragraph by Terence's standards, taking up more than half the page. It delves into the population of the 17 and explains why a tribe so old, after so many generations, could be portrayed in full by just a handful of shirtless, unshaven extras. Quote, Andor was leading the warriors of the Seva team along the forest path that led to the wall. Beside him marched Neva in his shaman's robe. Andor glanced over his shoulder at the file of warriors behind him. A pitiful handful they were, too, he thought. The Seva team were dwindling year by year. Hunting accidents, famine, disease, and above all the endless futile attacks upon the wall, had reduced their numbers to a few grizzled warriors, together with the boys who had just attained manhood. Much more of this, and Zoannon would have no Sevatim left to worship him. Still, this time it was going to be different. This time they were going to storm the wall, rescue Zoannon, and bring about an age of endless peace and prosperity for the tribe. Andor was doing his best to make himself believe that Neva's prophecies would all come true, but his heart was full of dread as he led his men along the trail. A lot happens in Part 2 on TV. The Doctor saves Leela from fatal poisoning and passes the test of the Horda. He and Leela walk back and forth from the mountains to the tribe camp several times. Terrence doesn't condense much and still manages to weave in sharp observations every few paragraphs. Leela, page 60. How could he, the Doctor, be so cheerful when he'd just been condemned to an agonizing death? And Terrence narrates the test of the Horda through the Doctor's eyes, as the Doctor solves the puzzle for the audience. When is the right time to fire the crossbow? Page 63. Quote, "It was an interesting problem," he thought. If he fired too soon, the rope would still be too thick to be broken by the crossbow bolt. If he left it too late, the plank would snap, and he would fall into the pit. The Doctor looked through the screen window at the rope. As Leela had warned him, it was getting steadily thinner, but it was moving faster too. Just a little longer. ... Of course, there are still awkward transitions, the way Chapter 7 goes from the breathless accounting of the test to a very quick half-scene chapter cliffhanger, where the voice of Zoannon announces that he's going to kill the Doctor. In editorial terms, Terrence gives the Doctor an extra bit of jeopardy and an acrobatic jump as the test of the Horda concludes. The Doctor's confusion over Leela's test instructions is eliminated. That bit of wordplay on TV sounds like it was a Tom Baker ad-lib, and thus not printed in the scripts from which Terrence worked. Also, where the Doctor says flapdoodle on TV, Terrence writes the word piffle. Flapdoodle also sounds like a Baker ad-lib. It's certainly a much funnier word, but piffle was the word in the book, which I read a lot more often in the mid-'80s than I saw the story on TV, so piffle was the word that I incorporated into my vocabulary, thinking, gee, what a great put-down. You can imagine how popular this didn't make me in junior high and high school. I stopped using the word piffle entirely in about 1990 or so, and you can figure out the exact day that I stopped using it by consulting the episode guide for the U.S. sitcom Head of the Class. There was an unbearably nerdy character to whom I bore an unfortunate resemblance at the time, and once he used the word on TV, I stopped using it entirely. The Part 2 cliffhanger is somewhat inverted. On TV, it's a double cliffhanger, the Doctor and Leela having a strange encounter inside the throat of the Zoannon mountain carving, and Andor getting killed by an id-beast-like creature bearing Tom Baker's face. Intercutting. In the book, Chapter 8 ends with the strange encounter, but that sequence follows Andor's death sequence, and there's no more intercutting. Instead, the cliffhanger moment falls mid-section on page 73, just a page before the end of the chapter. I've been dismissive of Andor's character on TV. He's no Diego Luna. But Victor Lucas did a good job in the role, with what little material he had. And the new characters who fill up the empty space in the story, and the parts 3 and 4 material after he's gone, aren't quite so well acted. Although this is a slim book, it contains on pages 79 and 80 the great retcon. And yes, I capitalized the G and the R. If you think about the most famous alterations or additions that Terrence made to books, this has to be it, right? A few weeks ago, on the Talons of Wang-Chiang episode, John and Kate talked about how Terrence gave a much deeper and richer history of World War VI in the 51st century than Robert Holmes had scripted on TV. But in this book, Face of Evil, Terrence tells us just when the Doctor visited the Morty expedition and inadvertently created the god Zoannon. Page 79. The Doctor stood staring into space, remembering. It had been somewhere near the beginning of that business with the giant robot. The Doctor had just undergone his latest regeneration. The early days of a new incarnation are always a tricky period for a Time Lord, and in this case the process had been hurriedly accelerated in order to save his life. He had been in a confused, irresponsible state, his new personality still not fully established. Even now his memories of those first days were hazy. There had been Sarah and the Brigadier, and the problem of the robot to grapple with. And all the time, there had been this overwhelming urge to go off into the TARDIS and just disappear. One night, the urge had been too strong and the Doctor had given way. He had sped off alone in the TARDIS to another time and another planet. This planet. He had found the colonists in trouble, repaired their computer with careless expertise, and gone on his way, leaving, he now realized, a terrible legacy behind him. Since the TARDIS had returned him to Earth, within minutes of his departure, no one ever knew that he'd been away. Indeed, he himself had almost forgotten the strange, dreamlike interlude, but somehow his unconscious mind knew, and it had brought him back to this planet to undo the harm he had done. Amazing stuff. Terence cheerfully places the off-screen visit within his own story, which he both scripted for TV and novelized, gives a rationale for why the Doctor took off in the middle of that story, and why he completely forgot the moment until the middle of his third season. The equivalent would be an episode like Knock Knock, hinging on some hidden adventure that Peter Capaldi had in the middle of Deep Breath. It's by far the most memorable passage of this book, and a sign of how much fun Terence must have had while typing this thing up. Oh, and later on, he adds the line of dialogue to one of the Doctor's explanations of the incident to Leela. Well, I wasn't quite myself at the time. Another way of establishing, which the TV episode did not, exactly when the Doctor first visited the Morty expedition. You could forgive Terence for taking the rest of the book off after that, but then he introduces Jabal, the Tesh captain, with a strong descriptive paragraph. Page 80. The Doctor looked curiously at him. For all his mild manner, there was a feeling of tremendous power about this man. Power rigidly controlled, held in check. Despite the quiet voice and the friendly smile, he had the fierce, burning eyes of a fanatic. He also pinpoints the moment when Jabal becomes suspicious of the Doctor, a tad earlier than happens on TV. The TV story's shift in emphasis from the Seven Team to the Tesh in Part 3 does take some of the air out of the story, as Lelon and I discussed earlier in the program, sidelining David Garfield and Leslie Schofield. But in the book, Terence tries to make the Tesh as interesting as he can. We also talked a bit in the Talons episode about what Terence does when the Doctor gives the wrong attribution to a quote on TV. Philip Hinchcliffe got around this problem in the Seeds of Doom book by dropping entirely the attribution to Franklin P. Adams, American humorist. The Doctor quotes Kipling on TV, but credits Gertrude Stein. Terence slyly fixes this in the book by changing the attribution to quote Kipling, or was it Gertrude Stein? ? Close quote. Chapter 11, entitled Xoanon, is short, and mostly encompasses the Doctor's ill-fated confrontation with Xoanon inside the Sacred Chamber, or as it's called on TV, the Sacred Heart. A short paragraph, but an effective one. One advantage to this book having more chapters than Terence's usual 4-part/12 chapter structure is that he can take a confrontation like this, the TV Part 3 cliffhanger moment, and make it stand out even more.
Xoanon.
I grow tired. I'm thinking no longer.
No, wait, Xoanon. I'm the Doctor. I'm separate. I'm real. You must acknowledge me.
I will not thank you.
We are Xoanon.
And I'm the Doctor.
No.
I am the Doctor.
No!
I am the Doctor.
No.
Who am I? Who am I?
The most famous lines that Chris Boucher ever wrote appear on page 104 of the novelization, virtually unaltered. Those words are his legacy. Say them with me now. The very powerful and the very stupid have one thing in common. They don't alter their views to fit the facts. They alter the facts to fit their views, which can be uncomfortable if you happen to be one of the facts that needs altering. You'd figure Terence would like those words. He does. In fact, he even gives the Doctor a victory lap after saying them. When Leela, who's been momentarily possessed by Xoanon, doesn't respond, Terence has the Doctor reflect that he was, quote, hurt by the lack of response to this rather neat turn of phrase. Speaking of which, And this is interesting for the novelization of a story that's so anti-religion. Terence titles Chapter 13 The Last Battle, which was, of course, the final book of C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, the book in which Aslan ends the world and everyone goes to heaven. Well, those who don't fall into the lake of fire or remain behind in a purgatory of disbelief. In heaven, Lewis's characters are happier to be dead than alive, and it turns out the whole Pevensey family is dead and they're all reunited in heaven. Except for Susan. We don't talk about Susan. I wonder if Terence titled the chapter this way as a purposeful allusion to Narnia, in writing the book version of a TV script that rejects the entire Lewis worldview wholesale. Terence, of course, continues to add digs and jabs and barbs whenever he can, usually at the expense of Caleb. The success of the attack had convinced him that he was a born general, Terence writes on page 109. Page 111, meanwhile, appears to contain a Tom Baker ad-lib. Remember this from the DVD text commentary? The scripted line, as Zoannon is trying to take out the Doctor in an atomic meltdown that will wipe out, quote, half the planet, was crude but effective. The DVD says that Baker flipped the line to effective but crude, giving the Doctor an aesthetic view of Zoannon's tactics, whimsical performance review. Terence changes the line slightly to effective but distressingly crude, and adds an additional line on top of the new word distressingly. I'm really rather disappointed in Zoannon. This is not quite as pithy as Tom Baker's take on TV, but it does up the performance review dynamic, although what we don't have is the compliment sandwich on either side of the insult. Chapter 14, not given a Narnia-themed name, is a vintage late 70s Terence action sequence chapter, made of short, propulsive sections with 3 lines of blank space between them, the net effect being a 3-page passage with more blank space than text. The book's climax comes in mid-chapter, rather than with a cliffhanger, but Terence makes slightly more clear on TV that it's Neva's suicide run at Zoannon, which distracts Zoannon long enough for the Doctor to flip the big plot switch that will end the threat and resolve the crisis. Page 121. Zoannon laughed, too, and suddenly the Doctor joined in, greatly relieved. Now he knew Zoannon was cured. A sense of humor is the finest proof of sanity. End quote. The nice thing about Chapter 14 is that it gives us an extended denouement, more than was common at this point in the series. There's the just plain nice scene of the Doctor and Leela visiting a cured Zoannon, though it is missing Tom Baker's comical double-take when Zoannon asks when he first started to go wrong. Also missing is Louise Jameson showing how Leela, coming from where she does, would not know how to sit on a sofa, the problem that doesn't seem to have occurred to Terence. Oh, and Baker's ad-lib about little Gentech? Not in the book, although that's probably just as well. Page 126. And a wheezing, groaning noise shattered the calm of the forest as the square blue shape of the TARDIS faded away. The Doctor was off on a new adventure with a new companion! Exclamation point. This is not the most powerful final sentence of a book that Terence would give us. That comes, arguably, in the next book up after this one. The exclamation point seems a little frivolous, but for a 120-page write-up of a pretty pointed and political story, Terence does his usual way better than average job of highlighting all the memorable stuff. He improves some of the character beats, yes, even with the Tesh, and while there are some slight issues with the script that he can't fix, I'd still say this is a more readable version of the story than Boucher's own full-length novels to come 20 to 25 years later. 1978 would be a surprisingly light year for the Target line, with only 7 books to be published, rather than the by now usual 11. After Face of Evil, in January, Terence gets a rare month off, and so does Target. The following book will be March, and it will be the adaptation of one of my favorite TV serials. A ton of memorable guest characters, a bracingly cynical worldview, a new monster, and fabulously dark direction. Come join me on Fang Rock, and discover the fate of the 3 lighthouse keepers, Doctor Who, and the horror of Fang Rock, next time on Doctor Who Literature. Thank you for joining me. On another episode of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast, I'm Jason, your host and editor and producer. Special thanks to my special guest, Lelon Stoldt. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at anchor.fm/DoctorWhoLit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, under the hashtag Doctor Who Pilgrimage, that's Dr. Who Pilgrimage, and on email at drwholiterature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.